I'm back for another spontaneous reading of the Shackleton story. Today it is part 3, chapter 1. Worsley named the place Mark Time Camp, but it didn't seem an especially appropriate name. It implied that they had halted only temporarily and would soon be on the move again, but nobody really believed that they would. After 5 days of exhausting struggle, they were suddenly idle. Now there was almost nothing to do except to think, and there was altogether too much time for that. Many of them, it seemed, finally grasped for the first time just how desperate things really were. More correctly, they became aware of their own inadequacy, of how utterly powerless they were. Until the march from Ocean Camp, they had nurtured in the backs of their minds the attitude Shackleton strove to unceasingly to imbue them with, a basic faith in themselves, that they could be, if need be, pit their strength and their determination against any obstacle and somehow overcome it. But then came the march, a journey which was to carry them nearly 200 miles. Yet, after only 5 days and 9 small miles in a straight line to the northwest, they had been stopped completely, and even forced to retreat. A gale could easily have carried them that far in 24 hours. So now they sat in Mark Time Camp, disillusioned and humbly aware how truly pygmy they were to overcome the forces they faced, regardless of how much strength and determination they put forth. The realization was not so much humiliating as frightening. Their ultimate goal was still to get themselves out, but now it was an empty phrase. They wouldn't get themselves out. Only if the pack chose, they might be permitted to escape. But for the present, they were powerless. There was no goal, not even the smallest achievable objective to aim for. They were faced with total uncertainty. Their position was, if anything, worse than it had been. They had abandoned a goodly quantity of stores, along with one of their boats, and while the floe they were camped on was adequate, it was no match for the giant back at Ocean Camp. "It is beginning to be an anxious time for us," Macklin wrote on New Year's Day. "For so far there's not much sign of any opening of the floe, and the broken, mushy stuff is quite unnavigable for our boats. If we cannot get away very soon, our position will be a very serious one, for if it comes to traveling in the autumn to Paulet by sledge, where will we get food for the dogs and food for ourselves? Supposing the depot at Paulet fails us, the seals will have disappeared for the winter, and we may have to undergo some of the trials of Greeley." Many of them made a sincere effort to be cheerful, but without much success. There was little to be cheerful about. The temperature remained just about at the freezing point, so that during the day the surface of the floes became a bog. They had to trudge about through knee-deep slush, and a man would often plunge up his waist into an unsuspected hole. Their clothes were thus continually soaked, and their only comfort was crawling into the comparatively bearable dampness of their sleeping bags each night. The food situation was also far from reassuring. There remained only 50 days' full trail provisions at 2 pounds per man, and the time when they would have looked upon such a supply as ample to see them out of the pack was long since past. They could hope to supplement their stores with seals and penguins, but there was disappointingly little game available, nowhere near as much as they had expected for this time of year. But on January 1st, it seemed that the new year might have brought with it a change of luck. 5 crab-eater seals and an emperor penguin were killed and brought into camp. Returning from a hunting trip, Ordleys, traveling on skis across the rotting surface of the ice, had just about reached camp when an evil, knob-like head burst out of the water just in front of him. He turned and fled, pushing as hard as he could with his ski poles and shouting for Wild to bring his rifle. The animal, a sea leopard, sprang out of the water and came after him, bounding across the ice with the peculiar-looking rocking horse gait of a seal on land. The beast looked like a small dinosaur with a long, serpentine neck. After a half-dozen leaps, the sea leopard had almost caught up with Ordleys when it unaccountably wheeled and plunged again into the water. By then, Ordleys had nearly reached the opposite side of the floe. He was about to cross to safe ice when the sea leopard's head exploded out of the water directly ahead of him. The animal had tracked a shadow across the ice. It made a savage lunge for Ordleys with its mouth open, revealing an enormous array of saw-like teeth. Ordleys' shouts for help rose to screams, and he turned and raced away from his attacker. The animal leaped out of the water again in pursuit just as Wild arrived with his rifle. The sea leopard spotted Wild and turned to attack him. Wild dropped to one knee and fired again and again, at the onrushing beast. It was less than 30 feet away when it finally dropped. 2 dog teams were required to bring the carcass into camp. It measured 12 feet long, and they estimated its weight at about 1,100 pounds. It was a predatory species of seal and resembled a leopard only in its spotted coat and its disposition. When it was butchered, balls of hair 2 and 3 inches in diameter were found in its stomach, the remains of crab-eater seals it had eaten. The sea leopard's jawbone, which measured nearly 9 inches across, was given to Ordleys as a souvenir of his encounter. In his diary that night, Worsley observed, "A man on foot in soft, deep snow and unarmed would not have a chance against such an animal, as they almost bound along with a rearing, undulating motion at least 5 miles an hour. They attacked without provocation, looking on man as a penguin or seal." The hunting parties continued to operate the next day, though the warm, muggy weather kept the surface of the ice soggy. 4 crab-eater seals were secured and returned to camp. While they were being butchered, Ordleys came back from a trip on skis and announced that he had found and killed 3 more. But Shackleton contended that the party already had a month's supply and ordered that the slain seals be left where they were. Several men found Shackleton's attitude difficult to understand. Greenstreet wrote that he considered it rather foolish, as things have not turned out at all as he had estimated up to the present, and it is far the best to be prepared for the possible chance of having to winter here. Greenstreet was right. Like most of the others, he considered the laying in of all possible meat the prudent thing to do, as any ordinary individual might. But Shackleton was not an ordinary individual. He was a man who believed completely in his own invincibility, and to whom defeat was a reflection of personal inadequacy. What might have been an act of reasonable caution to the average person was to Shackleton a detestable admission that failure was a possibility. The indomitable self-confidence of Shackleton's took the form of optimism, and it worked in 2 ways. It set men's souls on fire, as Macklin said. Just to be in his presence was an experience. It was what made Shackleton so great a leader. But at the same time, the basic egotism that gave rise to his enormous self-reliance occasionally blinded him to realities. He tacitly expected those around him to reflect his own extreme optimism, and he could be almost petulant if they failed to do so. Such an attitude, he felt, cast doubt on him and his ability to lead them to safety. Thus, it was that the simple suggestion of bringing in 3 seals could be, to Shackleton's mind, an act of disloyalty. At another time, he may have overlooked the incident, but just now he was hypersensitive. Almost everything he had undertaken, the expedition, saving the Endurance, and 2 attempted marches to safety, had failed miserably. In addition, the lives of 27 other men were in his hands. "I am rather tired," he wrote one day. "I suppose it is the strain." Then later, "I long for some rest, free from thought." Matters did not improve during the next several days. The weather continued to deteriorate, which seemed hardly possible. Daytime temperatures climbed as high as 37 degrees, with long periods of wet snow falling, mixed with rain. A regular Scotch mist, Worsley called it. There was little for them to do but lie in their tents, trying to sleep, playing cards, or simply thinking about how hungry they were. "A squaw gull appeared," wrote Macklin. "He settled down on a refuse pit, entrails of seals, etc., and gorged himself to his heart's content. Lucky gull. James, in Shackleton's tent, did some physics trying to recall some of my theory work, but soon tired of it. The occupants of Wild's tent had to shift their sleeping bags because the heat from their bodies was melting the snow, robbing them of the last bit of comfort offered by a dry place to sleep. Even Hussey's banjo lost its appeal for some. McNeish complained, "Hussey is at present tormenting us with his 6 known tunes on his banjo." Shackleton recorded on January 9th, "I'm growing anxious now with all of this party." And well, he might have been. For almost a month, there had been no wind stronger than a breeze, and even this had been mostly from the north. And during the past week, they had killed only 2 seals, thus remained almost motionless, while their supply of meat dwindled alarmingly. Shackleton's contention that it would last a month proved grossly exaggerated. After only 10 days at mark time camp, the strain was beginning to tell. Greenstreet wrote, "The monotony of life here is getting on our nerves. Nothing to do, nowhere to walk, no change in surroundings, food, or anything. God send us open water soon, or we shall go balmy." Then, on January 13th, a rumor spread that Shackleton was considering killing the dogs to ease the drain on the food supplies. Among the men, reactions ranged from simple resignation to outraged shock. Stormy debates on the value of the dogs against the food they consumed broke out in each tent that night. But the fundamental, underlying factor in these discussions was that for many men, the dogs were more than so many pounds of pulling power on the trail. There was a deep emotional attachment involved. It was the basic human need to love something, the desire to express tenderness in this barren place. Though the dogs were vicious, surely beasts with one another, their devotion and loyalty toward the men was above question. And the men responded with an affection greeting, surpassing anything that they would have felt under ordinary circumstances. At the thought of losing Gruss, a puppy born a year before on the Endurance, Macklin reflected, "He is a fine little dog, hard-working, and of good disposition. Also, I have had him, fed him, and trained him since he was born. I remembered taking him out when he was a puppy in my pocket, only his nose peeping out and getting covered with frost. I used to take him on the sledges when I was driving the team, and in those early days, he used to take an active interest in the doings of the dogs. Under the best circumstances, it would have been upsetting news. Under their present circumstances, it was amplified in the minds of some men almost to a catastrophe. In their bitterness, a few, like Greenstreet, were inclined to fix the blame on Shackleton, with some justification. The present shortage of food, Greenstreet wrote, is due simply and solely from the boss refusing to get seals when they were to be had, and even refusing to let orderlies to go out to look for them. His sublime optimism, all the way through, being to my mind absolute foolishness. Everything right away through was going to turn out all right, and no notice was taken of things possibly turning out otherwise, and here we are." Shackleton made no mention of killing the dogs the next morning. Instead, he ordered the men to shift camp because their floe was melting at a dangerous rate. The soot from the blubber stove had been tracked all over the surface of the ice, and it was holding the heat of the sun. The men began at noon to construct a roadway of blocks of ice and snow to bridge the gap to a floe about 150 yards to the southeast. The move was completed early in the afternoon. They named their new location Patience Camp. Then, in a quiet, level voice, Shackleton ordered Wild to shoot his own team, along with McElroy's, Marston's, and Crean's. There was no protest, no argument. The 4 drivers obediently harnessed their teams and drove the dogs about a quarter of a mile away from the camp. The drivers then returned alone, except for McElroy. He and Macklin were to assist Wild. Each dog in turn was taken off his trace and led behind a row of large ice hummocks. There, Wild sat the animals in the snow, took the muzzle in his left hand, and placed his revolver closer to its head. Death was instantaneous. After each dog had been killed, Macklin and McElroy dragged its body a short distance away, then returned to the waiting teams for the next animal. None of the dogs seemed to sense what was happening, and each went unsuspectingly around the ice hummock to his death with his tail wagging. When the job was done, the 3 men piled snow on top of the heap of dog bodies and walked slowly back to camp. Shackleton decided to spare Greenstreet's team of year-old puppies for the present, and he also granted a 1-day reprieve to Hurley's and Macklin's teams so that they might be used to make a trip back to Ocean Camp for some of the food that had been left there. The 2 sledges were made ready, and Hurley and Macklin started off at 6:30 that evening. It was an exhausting journey, lasting almost 10 hours because they had to travel mostly over deep, soft snow and broken ice, and the dogs sank down to their bellies. As Macklin wrote later, "The going was so bad that they could not pull my weight, and I had to get off and flounder along beside the sledges. The dogs, too, kept falling back, and as soon as one dog collapsed or let his weight come onto the trace, the whole line stopped. On these occasions, they all lay down, and only violent abuse or vigorous treatment had any effect in raising them. Several pressure ridges had to be broken with pick and shovel. Finally, with all the dogs dead beat, we crawled into Ocean Camp about 4 a.m. They found the place almost underwater. To get into the galley where the stores were, they had to lay down a bridge of planks. However, they managed to collect 2 loads of about 500 pounds apiece, consisting of canned vegetables, tapioca, dog pemmican, and jam. They prepared themselves a good meal of canned stew, fed the dogs, and started back at 6:30 a.m. The return journey was comparatively easy because they had their own tracks to follow. The dogs pulled magnificently through Old Boston, Macklin's leader. Was so exhausted he repeatedly vomited and staggered badly. The two sledges reached Patient's camp at 1 p.m, and the dogs dropped in the snow, Macklin recorded, some of them not even rousing themselves to take their food. Lying in his sleeping bag that night, Macklin warily recorded the events of the journey in his diary. In a tired hand, he concluded the entry, "My dogs will be shot tomorrow."